Hello, and good evening. What if the past wasn't just something you remember, but something that could come back to haunt you? Welcome to Coagulation 8, Nostalgia, where memories twist into nightmares. Tonight we're diving into a chilling tale that will make you rethink your fondest memories. Stay with us, if you dare. I'm Cora Poe, and this is Slumber Myth, a place for insomnia fuel. We will meet a man named Peter, who has left a mere shadow of his former self after an impossibly strange ordeal. Tonight's story is borrowed from the pages of the anthology Coagulation 8, Nostalgia. Support the Coagulation Foundation and its talented participants by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoagulationfoundation. Now, let us begin the harrowing tale by Noelle Mills entitled Shadow Haunting. Peter pretended he didn't see it. He pretended as if it wasn't there, following him wherever he went. But no matter where he turned, there it was, reminding him of a past he was determined to forget. When he caught it staring at him from the corner of his eye, he would avert his gaze, telling himself it wasn't real. Shadows weren't living things, beings. They had no mind of their own, and most importantly, they couldn't hurt him. It was all in his head, or so he believed, until it started to speak to him. It happened one night as he was attempting to fall asleep. A chilly breeze drifted through the open window. Stars gleamed in the night sky. Peter still liked to look out at the stars on a clear night. That was until the shadow came. It stepped into the room, its foot clinging to the wall. The legs followed, as did a torso, and then the arms, longer than humans, with knife-like fingers that reached down to its knees. It had no eyes to see, yet Peter somehow knew that didn't matter. The gas street lamps flickered, and the shadow blinked out of existence for a moment. Peter, who had been frozen beneath the covers, sat up suddenly, staring at the spot on the wall where the shadow had been, heart in his throat, glancing at the faded, blue-striped walls as he checked all the surfaces and even steeled himself enough to check under the bed, revealing nothing except some old boxes. With a sigh of relief, he drew in several long and slow breaths, attempting to ground himself in rationality as he rubbed his face. Just a nightmare, not real. You know it's not real, he told himself. Breathing in slowly, he let himself relax and fell back into bed. There, growing larger and looming overhead upon the ceiling, was the shadow. The scream caught in Peter's throat as the shadow put a single knife-like finger to its lips, silencing him. Darkness grew out from it, coating the entire room, crawling up the bed until it reached Peter's body. He lay there, paralyzed, the tendrils of darkness wrapped around him. An invisible hand pressed over his lips. He couldn't scream or cry out. Searing pain cut into him as the shadowed tendrils fused to his skin. Above him, the shadow leered, triumphant. A voice echoed in his head.
Now, Peter. You didn't really think you'd escape, did you? You can't cut me away this time. We're not in Neverland anymore.
Peter squeezed his eyes shut and struggled against the invisible force silencing him, breaking through like a drowning man in an ocean, coming up for air.
No! You're not real. It's not real. None of it was real.
Cold sweat coated his lips. Yet, when he opened his eyes, he no longer felt the pain, and the only shadows in the room were from the furniture. With a shaking hand, he fumbled for the matches in his bedside drawer and struck a match. He snapped the first and the second, but the third one lit, and he placed the flame into the gas lamp on his bedside. The light bloomed around the room, lengthening the shadows. Tearing away the covers, he sprang up onto his feather bed, eyes darting around for the slightest inconsistency, the slightest movement out of place. But the walls remained the same striped blue pattern, and the shadows around the furniture cowed in the same light of the lamp. His eyes scanned the ceiling too. He had to be certain.
See? Nothing. Not real. Not real. It's not real.
He muttered to himself, wiping the sweat from his brow on his pajama sleeve. Despite his words, he couldn't bring himself to turn around and look over his shoulder, for fear of what he might see. Holding out the lamp in his shaking hand, he grit his teeth and steeled himself. His head turned slowly, and he forced himself to look. He had to know. The silhouette upon the wall mirrored his actions as he made them. It obeyed the light's shifting glow. Peter stared at it with unblinking eyes, checking every detail from the top of his head to the base of his heels, where the shadow touched his skin. With his free hand, he made the shadow puppet of a crocodile on the wall. The silhouette's hand copied the crocodile.
See? I'm in control. It's not real. It was a nightmare.
He reassured himself. He lowered himself back down, sitting with his legs crossed on the bed. For several minutes, he concentrated on his breathing, the weight of the soft feather duvet, the coolness of his cotton sheets, and the tickle against his ankle from the slightly scratchy navy blue blanket at the end of the bed. Once he had finally calmed himself down, he set the lamp on the bedside table and laid his head upon the pillow, pulling the blankets back over himself. Somewhere in the house, a clock let out a low bong, bong, bong to mark the early hour. Silently, Peter prayed for a night of dreamless sleep. The moment he shut his eyes, a voice sounded in his head.
Tick-tock, Peter, tick-tock.
For days and nights on end, Peter lived in a state of constant denial. He knew the shadow wasn't really there, leaning against the desk, watching him as he shuffled papers at work. He knew the shadow wasn't watching him from the wall of the pub while he sipped his ale. He knew he wasn't really being followed by some menacing presence on the walk home. All of these rationalities he knew could not be true. Not in this world, not in real life. And if it wasn't real, then it was all in his head. If he were still a child, the doctors would chalk it up to an overactive imagination or a recurring nightmare. Now that he was an adult, however, it would be different. At best, he might get some sleeping pills from a bad doctor who didn't believe him and assumed it was simply suffering from sleep deprivation or some addiction. At worst, a good doctor would hear him talking about hallucinations and throw him in an asylum. It was one thing to see things that weren't there, but it was a whole other when the things that weren't there talked back. So he kept his head down at work. He focused on every letter of request that came in, took notes at every meeting, and closed the books on accounts at a rate that got his boss to notice. When Mr. Jeffries commented on his incredible dedication to the job, Peter smiled at him, accepting the handshake he offered. Then a cold dread passed through him when he saw the shadow on the wall, slowly clapping his hands together in mock approval.
Well done, Peter. Though I wonder if Mr. Jeffries would be shaking your hand if he knew how much blood was on it.
Wearing the smile like a mask, Peter quickly shoved his hands into his pockets, hoping to appear bashful instead of the horrible terror that was making his palms sweat. He focused on Mr. Jeffries instead, who had moved on to a topic of the brand new branch development across town Though Peter smiled through the positive assurances that his hard work was being noticed, the whole time Mr. Jeffrey spoke, Peter prayed the shadow on the wall behind him would go away, vanish, disappear. But it didn't. It stayed, and it watched. At the pub, he sat with some friends from work, settled into a round of drinks, arguing about who amongst them would win a wrestling match. With no mat upon which to demonstrate their prowess, the lads rolled up their sleeves and had started an arm wrestling match instead. When Benny, a cashier, challenged him, Peter rolled up his sleeve like all the others.
You can't beat me, Pete. Look at those freckled noodles. I'd snap your arm like a twig.
Benny taunted, smirking from behind crooked teeth.
Guess we'll see,
Peter said, setting his elbow on the table, a wicked grin pulling at the corner of his lip. Bam! The other lads cheered and heckled Benny, who looked like he was sucking on the sour grapes of his loss, shaking out his defeated arm.
Well, you certainly don't look it, but you're tougher than you look.
Yeah, he is. Put his name on the board.
Hugh called out to Lester, who scrawled Peter's name in chalk on the slate next to the dartboard, along with the other victors. A cheer went out as the food they'd ordered came out of the kitchen, and they took a break from their matches to refuel. Like several of the lads, Peter had ordered steak and roasted veg for dinner. The red juices of the steak poured into the plate like an eager tide. As Peter's knife sawed through the meat, he heard the shadow in his mind.
Peter, Peter, people eater. Do they know, Peter? Would they still be around you, laughing it up if they knew?
Peter's stomach flipped over in his gut. His knife and fork froze halfway through a slice. The plate that had been so appetizing only a moment ago now made him want to vomit. Benny noticed his sudden stillness.
Hey, what's wrong with you, Pete? You look like you're gonna be sick.
A line creased in Benny's brow. Pete flinched under the shrewd, cold blue eyes. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his heart pounded in his ears. He couldn't let any of them see, couldn't let any of them know. But under Benny's gaze, he felt a prying sensation. Others noticed him pause and turned to look, casting him further under an oppressive spotlight of watchful eyes. The shadow's words prickled under his skin. That concludes part 1 of Shadow Haunting by the talented Noelle Mills. Join us next week for the next spine-tingling chapter of this story from the Coagulation Foundation's anthology, Coagulation Volume 8, Nostalgia. This volume is currently for sale at our publishing partner website, lulu.com. Please support the Coagulation Foundation in bringing inclusivity to science fiction and horror media. Next time, we will discover what becomes of Peter and his sadist shadow demon. Happy nightmares!